Hey, it's me, Tarek here, and since spring is around the corner, today I will be talking about an issue that occurs during the springtime, and that is called algal bloom. Algal bloom involves this sea plant called algae, and algae is a very important plant to aquatic environments like oceans, lakes, swamps, because algae performs this very important process in order for all of life to live, and that is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes water and carbon dioxide and makes oxygen and glucose. And since in the water, not many creatures have access to sunlight, algae is located on the surface of the water, and it takes that sunlight and converts it to oxygen and glucose, so all those creatures living underneath the water where sunlight can't reach them, they can get oxygen and nutrients from that algae. And algae is a very important sea plant. It is also very common. It is found in almost any aquatic environment, like oceans, swamps, lakes, rivers. Algae is a very important sea plant to any sea creature Sadly, there is a but though. Too much algae can be very bad for an aquatic environment. Some people may think it might be really good because you might get more oxygen or more glucose, meaning underneath the water, more sea creatures get more nutrients and more oxygen. But that is actually the complete opposite. In fact, too much algae can cause a lot of detrimental effects to any aquatic environment and can cause a lot of really bad things to happen. The reason why algal bloom occurs is because of two very important nutrients that all of life needs, and that is nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are important in any organism. Nitrogen provides the materials needed to create bones, as well as nucleic acids, as well as phosphorus. Most of our DNA is made out of phosphorus. And most of plants, in order for plants to reproduce, they need nitrogen and phosphorus. And algae is a plant, so I guess algae also needs nitrogen and phosphorus to reproduce. And algae gets its nitrogen and phosphorus from runoffs. And runoffs are basically water that goes and drains from the surface into an aquatic environment. And when water drains, water pulls nutrients with it. Just like in our body, water provides us with a lot of nutrients because water helps carry all this nutrients and all these important material that we need. And so do runoffs. Runoffs go through the grass, go through anywhere on the surface that has nutrients, and carries nitrogen and phosphorus into aquatic environments like seas, swamps, rivers, lakes. It all relies on runoffs in order to get its nutrients. Sadly, there is another but. All plants need phosphorus and nitrogen in order to reproduce. So in order for algae to create more algae, they need phosphorus and nitrogen. And since farmers during the springtime like to garden and like to harvest during the summer, they like to plant a lot of plants. And in order for plants to grow, they need nitrogen and phosphorus. And usually plants get nitrogen and phosphorus from each other. Usually if a plant dies and decays, usually it decomposes and the nitrogen and phosphorus are returned to the soil so the new plants can have nitrogen and phosphorus in order for them to live. Or also, there is bacteria that actually converts atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which is a usable form of nitrogen, in order for plants to get nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, this is good, but when you consider farmers plant all our foods like fruits and vegetables, which are plants, they also need nitrogen and phosphorus. But since farmers pick the fruit and vegetables before they die, the last destination of these fruits and vegetables will be our bellies, not the field that they're growing in. There isn't that much nitrogen and phosphorus being passed around to the new generation of fruits or vegetables that is going to come to be. So that is where fertilizer comes in, and fertilizer is just like plant food. You've probably heard that plants need fertilizer in order to continue growing, and that is absolutely true. And probably by now you can probably guess what fertilizer is primarily made out of, and that is nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus make up fertilizer, and that is why farmers need to fertilize plants whenever they pick up a new plant. Because keep in mind, plants always get nitrogen and phosphorus from decaying plants or really dead plants. But since we need the fruits and vegetables to eat so we can get nitrogen and phosphorus, those poor new generation of plants, those new generation of carrots, or those new generation of apples can't get any nitrogen and phosphorus. So they need fertilizer. Sadly, there is another but, and that is that the misuse of fertilizer causes algal bloom to become possible. You may think fertilizer is this very revolutionary invention, which it actually is. I mean, it allows us to have our fruits and vegetables without worrying about the environment around us. But too much fertilizer can cause algal bloom to become possible. If farmers use so much fertilizer in their soil, the water that comes from the runoff from the melted snow carries all that nitrogen and phosphorus to the aquatic environments. And now that there is so much nitrogen and phosphorus in the aquatic soil, more algae can grow. And guess what? When you have more algae, you have more photosynthesis occurring. You may think this is actually really good because you have more photosynthesis occurring, meaning that more sea creatures get oxygen, meaning more life can happen in aquatic environments, but that is actually not good at all. The thing is, photosynthesis also requires lots of oxygen in order to do it, because algae, again, are living things just like us, and they also require oxygen. And when you have so much algae in the water, you have so much oxygen consumption, meaning that algae primarily consume most of the water's oxygen supply, leaving barely any oxygen for the other sea creatures to have for themselves, meaning that sea creatures start to die because of the lack of oxygen. The more they photosynthesize, the more that the algae is going to have better conditions to grow in. Again, in the water, there isn't that much good conditions in order for life to occur, because there isn't a lot of oxygen and there also isn't a lot of nutrients. But since algae live above the water, they have much more sunlight, and the more oxygen they have, the more better and the more stable the conditions are to grow more algae. So more algae can actually grow because of photosynthesis, and guess what? More algae are consuming the oxygen, and this occurs again and again. And plus, it gets even worse. The dead sea creatures like fish and seahorses or any other sea creatures that have been affected and that actually die, whenever something dies in our environment, it gets decomposed. And guess what fish and other sea creatures have? They have nitrogen and phosphorus. So when sea creatures get decomposed, more nitrogen and more phosphorus go into the aquatic soils, and the algae pick up all that nitrogen and phosphorus, and guess what? More algae gets created, and more photosynthesis, and more oxygen being consumed, and more sea creatures dying, and then more algae, and more oxygen, and more sea creatures dying, more algae, more oxygen, more sea creatures dying. You're probably starting to get it now. It is a reoccurring issue. It is a reoccurring negative loop that never ever stops. But luckily, we do have a solution towards this issue, and that is providing measurements on fertilizing containers. Many fertilizing containers today have a lot of measurements in order to make sure that farmers give their plants the right amount of fertilizer. And luckily, most fertilizer containers also have these little pop-off cups. Usually the lids of fertilizer containers today are these little cups that you can pour the fertilizer into in order to make sure that you're giving your plants the right amount of fertilizer. And that solution keeps everyone happy. It keeps us humans happy because we can have our fruits and vegetables in peace. It also keeps all the sea creatures happy because they can have all their oxygen. And that's it for Algal Bloom. Luckily, this environmental problem does have a bit of a solution, and luckily it does have a bit of a happy ending as well, unlike most environmental problems. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching.